Welcome to ICPR 2026, our 7th major conference since 2010. ICPR brings together anthropologists, cognitive scientists, psychologists, philosophers, religious scholars, art critics, archivists, clinical researchers, psychiatrists, historians. We also give a voice and a podium to people with lived experience, to trial participants. We are very grateful to have indigenous leaders from the Tucano, the Omagua, the Yapamasa peoples from Brazil, the Wirarica in Mexico, the Shipibo, Conibo, and Ashaninka in Peru.
There's this invitation for you with psychedelics to actually step into a bigger consciousness.
I personally consider that ayahuasca saved my life.
I have seen now case studies only of women who have autoimmune disorders, often thyroid-related autoimmune disorders, which then affect their fertility, go into ceremony with ayahuasca and psilocybin, come out and see an almost instantaneous reduction in the autoimmune response that they are having. And I think that is incredible.
Sometimes you have, to have this kind of discussions, you really have to meet people in person, and there are not a lot of people that share that taste for things about that specific thing around. So here you have all of them in the same room. It's beautiful.
I'm enjoying the conference very much because I like the different perspectives. It's really interdisciplinary, so you can find many different points of view, cultural, sociological, but of course many interesting contemporary psychedelic research. So it's a great place to be.
The psychedelics can abort an attack, they can stop you from having your cluster headache cycle, and they can prevent a cycle depending on how you use them. And there's no other medicine like that.
The classic story of somebody with depression who struggled and tried a bunch of different treatments and psychotherapies and pills and nothing worked, and then they take psilocybin and then boom, their depression is lifted and they have this very meaningful experience, and the next day they're completely in remission, and that lasts for months and months and months. I've seen that many times. And it's extremely impressive. It's one of the most impressive things I've seen in psychiatry.
In 5 years, I would expect that at least some of these medicines will be part of the standard care and that they will be fully reimbursed because it's working.
It's very good to be in touch with what's going on and see all these rigorous scientists doing their work, which is very, very impressive.
I work with drug education and harm reduction, particularly in like the rave culture and the underground scene. I go primarily here for networking.
A minha vinda aqui é para cumprimentar a nova geração de ayahuasqueiros e desejar um bom sucesso. Assim, compreendendo a minha palavra, eles poderão defender melhor os povos indígenas que moram na Amazônia, que são ayahuasqueiros, defensores de muitas medicinas.
These experiences can help us recognize that some of the things about consciousness we might have taken for granted, we shouldn't take for granted.
Psychedelic can just maybe even give you some beliefs that you're this being that will, continue in some way, part of this fabric of the cosmos. And if you can get that visceral feeling of that through psychedelics, that's amazing.
The mind and the spirit coming, or at least trying to come together, is something that is really, really interesting.
Is it your first time at ICPR?
Yes, it's my first time here.
How do you feel?
It's been great. I really like it, and I think for us, 2028, we'll definitely do a repeat. We'll be here again. I worked in academia for quite some time in research and moved into the nonprofit world to help protect psychedelic medicines from companies and entities that are monopolizing the field through egregious, overly broad patenting of known compounds or practices that are already taught.
We are a naturally derived psychoactive compound manufacturer in Southern Africa, so I don't get out of the laboratory very often.
It is always very humbling to see what we all don't know yet and what answers we don't have yet. And that's also why it's so important to do this together, to learn from each other and to do it in a collaborative manner.
You need roots to fly. If you don't have your roots, then you fly off. This is also what we do with Psych. We try to be this anchor for people. If they fly off, we try to meet them where they are and gently bring them back to the ground.